I'm Martin Jackson. I was interviewed in San Antonio, Texas. I have about 85 years of good memory to call on. I'm 90, and so I'm not counting my first 5 years. I'll try to give you as clear a picture as I can. If you want to give me a copy of what you are going to write, I'd appreciate it. Maybe some of my children would like to have it. I was here in Texas when the Civil War was first talked about. I was here when the war started and following my young master into it with the 1st Texas Cavalry. I was here during Reconstruction, after the war. I was here during the European World War and the second week after the United States declared war on Germany. I enlisted as cook at Camp Leon Springs. This sounds as if I liked the war racket. But as a matter of fact, I never wore a uniform, gray coat, or khaki coat, or carried a gun unless it happened to be one worth saving after some Confederate soldier got shot. I was official lugger-in of men that got wounded, and might have been called a Red Cross worker if we had had such a corps connected to our company. My father was head cook for the battalion, and between times I helped him out with the mess. There was some difference in the food served to soldiers in 1861 and 1917. Just what my feelings about the war, I have never been able to figure out myself. I know the Yanks were going to win from the beginning. I wanted them to win and kick us Southerners, but I hoped they was going to do it without wiping out our company. I'll come back to that in a minute. As I said, our company was the 1st Texas Cavalry. Colonel Buchel was our commander. He was a full-blooded German, and as fine a man and a soldier as you ever saw. He was killed at the Battle of Marshall and died in my arms. You may also be interested to know that my old master, Alvin Fitzpatrick, was the grandfather of Governor Jim Ferguson. Lots of old slaves closes the door before they tell the truth about their days in slavery. When the door is open, they tell how kind their masters was and how rosy it all was. You can't blame them for this, because they had plenty of good discipline, making them cautious about saying anything uncomplimentary about their masters. I myself was in a little different position than most slaves, and as a consequence have no grudges or resentment. However, I can tell you the life of the average slave was not rosy. They were dealt out plenty of cruel suffering. Even with my good treatment, I spent most of my time planning and thinking of running away. I could have done it easy, but my old father used to say, "No use running from bad to worse, hunting better." Lots of colored boys did escape and join the Union Army, and there are plenty of them drawing pension today. My father was always counseling me. He said, "Every man has to serve God under his own vine and fig tree." He kept pointing out that the war wasn't going to last forever, but that our forever was going to be spent living among Southerners after they got licked. He'd cite examples of how the whites would stand flat-footed and fight for the blacks the same as for members of their own family. I knew that was all true, but still I rebelled from inside of me. I think I really was afraid to run away, because I thought my conscience would haunt me. My father knew I felt this way, and he'd rub my fears in deep. One of his remarks still rings in my ears. A clear conscience opens bowels, and when you have a guilty soul, it ties you up, and death will not for long desert you. I haven't had no education. I should have had one, though. My old missus was sorry after the war that she didn't teach me. Her name before she married my old master was Mrs. Long. She lived in New York City and had 3 sons. When my old master's wife died, he wrote up to a friend of his in New York, a very prominent merchant named C.C. Stewart. He told his friend he wanted a wife and gave him specifications for one. Well, Mrs. Long, whose husband had died, fitted the bill, and she was sent down to Texas. She became Mrs. Fitzpatrick. She wasn't the grandmother of the Governor Ferguson, Old Fitzpatrick had 2 wives that preceded Mrs. Long. One of the wives had a daughter named Fanny Fitzpatrick, and it was her that was the Texas governor's mother. I seem to have the complicated family tree of my old master more clear than I've got my own, although mine can be put in a nutshell. I married only once, and was blessed in it with 45 years of devotion. I had 13 children and a big crop of grandchildren. My earliest recollection is the day my old boss presented me to his son Joe as his property. I was about 5 years old and my new master only 2. Yes, it was the Battle of Marshall in Louisiana that Colonel Bushell got shot. I was about 3 miles from the front, where I was pitched up, a kind of first aid station. I was all alone there. I watched the whole thing. I could hear the shooting and see the firing. I remember standing there and thinking, the South don't have a chance. All of a sudden I heard someone call. It was a soldier who was half carrying Colonel Bushell in. I didn't do nothing for the colonel. He was too far gone. I just held him comfortable, and that was the position he was in when he stopped breathing. That was the worst hurt I got when anybody died. He was a friend of mine. He had had a lot of soldiering before and fought in the Indian War. Well, the Battle of Marshall broke the back of the Texas cavalry. We began straggling back towards New Orleans, and by that time the war was over. The soldiers began to scatter. They was a sorry-looking bunch of lost sheep. They didn't know where to go, but most of 'em ended up pretty close to the towns they started from. They was like homing pigeons with only the instinct to go home, and yet most of 'em had no home to go to. I never went into books. I used to handle a big dictionary 3 times a day, but it was only to put it on a chair so my young master could sit up higher at the table. I never went to school. I learned to talk pretty good by associating with my masters in the big house. We lived on a ranch of about 1,000 acres close to the Jackson County line in Victoria County, about 125 miles from San Antonio. Just before the war ended, they sold the ranch, slaves and all, and the family, not away fighting, moved to Galveston. Of course, my father and me wasn't sold with the other blacks because we was away at war. My mother was drowned years before when I was a little boy. I remember her after her death. I can take you to the spot in the river today where she was drowned. She drowned herself. I never knew the reason behind it, but it was said she started to lose her mind and preferred death to that. The master's name was usually adopted by a slave after he was set free. This was done more because it was the logical thing to do and the easiest way to be identified than it was through affection for the master. Also, the government seemed to be in an almighty hurry to get us last names. We had to register as someone so we could be citizens. Well, I got to thinking about all us slaves that was going to take the name Fitzpatrick. I made up my mind I'd find me a different name. One of my grandfathers in Africa was called JCO, and so I decided to be Jackson.